Today, we're here to discuss the Korean War, which is just really an extension of the Cold War. It's part of the Cold War that we started to talk about. First of all, let's take a look at the background. So we're going to look at how the Korean War got started, why it got started, what the fighting is all about, what are we dealing with when we actually talk about the war. So in order to understand the Korean War, we actually have to take a trip to China. So after World War II, we've got two groups of people who are fighting for control of China. We've got one group of people who are known as the nationalists. They are led by a guy named Chiang Kai-shek. Chiang Kai-shek was trained in the United States. He was educated in the United States. He was very pro-American, very pro-democracy. And as a result, America will give him, I don't know, roughly about $3 billion in aid. So Chiang Kai-shek, he is our guy. On the other side, we've got a guy named Mao Zedong. Mao Zedong is supported by the communists in China. And because he is a communist, naturally, he's going to get a lot of support from, you guessed it, the Soviet Union. Remember, the Soviet Union is seeking to expand communism across the world, and so this is just an opportunity for them to continue to do that. So what we see is in March of 1946, there's going to be a civil war in China. That civil war is going to begin in March of 46, going to go to May of 1950, in which the nationalists are going to fight against the communists. Now, the problem that the nationalists have going for them is they're not very nice people. They kind of treat the citizens pretty poorly. There's not a lot of rights. The Chiang Kai-shek in some ways is kind of corrupt. So they're not going to be too popular among the people in China, which is going to lead the communists to actually be pretty popular in China. They try to meet the needs of the people. They help the common everyday man. And by May of 1949, the nationalists are in exile. They have lost. And Chiang Kai-shek and his people, they're in exile, and they go to the tiny little island of Taiwan. So we've got all of mainland China, the big China, the green stuff that you see on the map. And then in the tiny little circle, we've got Taiwan, the tiny little island. But here's the thing. Once they get to the tiny little island, once they get to Taiwan, Chiang Kai-shek claims that he still has control over all of mainland China. He does not. In reality, Chiang Kai-shek only has control over Taiwan. Mao Zedong is controlling all of mainland China, but Chiang Kai-shek is going to claim to be the real leader of China. Now, how does this fit into the Cold War? Well, if you haven't guessed it yet, this is where the policy of containment comes in. Remember, the goal of the United States is to contain the spread of communism, to stop the spread of communism from happening. Does it work in China? No, it fails miserably. In fact, containment didn't work. The communist Mao Zedong came to power in China. So understanding this is going to help us understand some of the decisions that get the United States involved in the Korean War. So that brings us to Korea. So Korea is, originally they were independent, and then they were taken over by Japan during World War II. And then after World War II, they were given their freedom, their independence. But like all other territories that were controlled by Japan during World War II, there was an occupation just to make sure war didn't break out again, just to make sure nothing crazy happened. So the North Korea, will be occupied by the Soviets. South Korea will be occupied by the United States. And there'll be sort of this artificial line drawn along the 38th parallel. The line of latitude. So we get this artificial line. There's really no rhyme or reason to it. The people in the north, the people in the south, they think of themselves as one solid Korea. It's just sort of what the United States and the Soviets carve out. By the end of 1949, they decide, well, this is a bad idea. We don't need to occupy anymore. Things are starting to stabilize within Korea. And so both the Soviets and the Americans decide that they're going to leave. They're going to leave Korea, and they're going to leave it up to the Koreans to figure out what they want to do. Now, initially, they start to form into North Korea and South Korea, which is where we're going to start to see the actual battles and the fighting and the war happen. So while initially North and South Korea kind of agreed to be independent countries, kind of agreed to do their own thing, the North wanted to control the South and the South wanted to control the North. And so not too soon after the Soviets and the Americans left, the North will invade South Korea. And in fact, they're not just going to invade, they're going to take over almost the entire nation. They're going to get everything reduced down to the Pusan perimeter, that tiny little green square in the southeastern corner of Korea. Other than that, pretty much, it doesn't take long for them to take over. Within 3 days after the invasion, the capital of South Korea, Seoul, is taken over. One of the major cities, Incheon, is taken over. It is not much of a battle. It is a pretty quick fight. The North is going to easily take over the South. Well, almost all of it, except the tiny little bit that we see down there in the Pusan perimeter.
Early the next morning on June 25th, all pretense of serenity is shattered. North Korean Communist forces begin an intense barrage of artillery and mortar fire, the message of which is unmistakable.
I was in Army headquarters in Seoul and thought that the problem was restricted to the 38th parallel. But then we got word that this was very serious. It wasn't just a skirmish. It was an invasion.
In the hope of forcing the reunification of the North and South as one communist-ruled country, North Korean Premier Kim Il-sung unleashes 100,000 well-trained and well-armed combat troops. They swarm into the South, meeting little resistance from a brave but ill-prepared South Korean army. Within 3 days, South Korea's capital, Seoul, falls. Refugees flee further south, the North soldiers in hot pursuit. July 15, 1950. North Korea and its tanks continue to roll through the South, like the Nazi blitzkrieg across France 10 years earlier. All the overpowered American and South Korean troops can do is delay what increasingly seems inevitable: defeat. In the United States, now that the public has figured out where...
So we can see that the North easily takes over the South. Of course, when an independent country invades another, we now have this new thing formed after World War II. In order to try to fix that, it is called the United Nations. And so everybody goes to the United Nations and says, do something about this. You can't let one country invade another. And so they do. The United Nations makes a call for the South Koreans, on behalf of the South Koreans, the United Nations makes a call for the withdrawal of all troops from Korea. They tell the North, you need to get out of the South. And then, of course, the North doesn't listen. And so this time we actually have something to make a difference. We have somebody who can do something about this. We actually have a military force for the United Nations. But the kicker is, in order for the military force to take action, in order to be allowed to use that military, we have to have the approval of what is called the Security Council. Those 5 nations are the United States, Great Britain, France, Soviet Union, and China. And so if we kind of break down how they're going to vote, how's the United States going to vote? Yes. Great Britain? Yes. France? Yes. Soviet Union? No. China? This is where things get tricky, and this is where that Chinese Civil War comes in. Because obviously communist China would probably vote no. But remember that the government that is running China is mainland China, run by Mao Zedong. But according to the United States, the people who are officially in control of China are, you guessed it, our friend Chiang Kai-shek, who is hanging out here down in Taiwan. And so when it comes time for China to vote, the United Nations is going to give Chiang Kai-shek the vote, not Mao Zedong. So now we've got 4-0 in favor of going to war, which leaves us with the Soviet Union, who is still going to say no. But the kicker about the Soviet Union is they are currently protesting the United Nations. They say, look, you are not recognizing mainland China. You should be. They're kind of ticked off that we're not recognizing mainland China. And as a result, they boycott the United Nations. And so, because they're boycotting, they're not there to vote, the resolution ultimately gets passed, and they end up going to war. Now, I think it's important that it is not the United States that is going to war. It is the United Nations. The whole goal of the United Nations, the whole goal from day one, is to liberate South Korea, is to free South Korea. We want to get the North out of the South. That is the only goal. So the way we're going to do this is by having the United Nations send troops. And officially, there are troops from 16 different nations that are going to make up the force of the United Nations. The way the United Nations works is every country that feels like participating gets to donate soldiers, essentially. Even though there were 16 different countries, 90% of the fighting force was American, and out of that 90% that was American, everybody was headed by Douglas MacArthur. Remember, Douglas MacArthur wrote the Constitution for Japan. He was really big in the rebuilding of Japan. He was that general during World War II. Now, of course, everything is over, and MacArthur is set to lead the troops. So what this war, what this invasion becomes, is essentially what we would call a proxy war. This is where the Cold War fits into the Korean War. The Korean War is essentially just part of the Cold War. A proxy war is when two people fight each other indirectly. So the United States is not directly fighting the Soviet Union. We're not sending troops to fight the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union is not sending troops to fight us. Instead, what's happening is the United States is supporting, or the United Nations, but we'll just say the United States because, let's face it, most of the UN forces were United States forces. The UN forces, or the American forces, we are supporting the South. We are part of that United Nations group that supports the South. And then supporting the North is going to be the Soviets. And in fact, we're later going to find out that most of the airplanes that were fighting on behalf of the North Koreans were actually piloted by Soviet pilots, but we didn't know that at the time. Joseph Stalin was smart enough to know that he probably shouldn't go directly to war with the United States, but he did care enough to the point where pretty much most of the supplies, most of the funding, most of the planning that went into the Korean War, it was done by the Soviets. So the Korean War is really the Soviets fighting the Americans, but we're doing it through a proxy. We're not doing it directly, we're doing it through North and South Korea. Which brings us to the first battle of the war, and I'm not going to quiz you on all the details of the battle. You don't need to know word by word everything that happens in every battle of the war. But early on, things go pretty well for the United States. Our original goal is to protect the Pusan line. We want to get in there and just make sure that the North doesn't take over any more of the South. They've already taken over 90% of it. We've got everything that's up that Pusan perimeter down there taken over. The goal when the United Nations first comes in, let's hold the perimeter. And so the United States is going to do that, and we're going to do it well.
General Walker had told us, no further withdrawal. This is it.
It is the beginning of the fight back.
Frontline films from Korea. Troops of the 1st Cavalry Division guardedly move forward to occupy a slope in the WWII area. Backing them up are tanks of the United Nations forces to help hold back the Red Korean divisions reportedly massing for a power drive on nearby Taegu.
In heat and dust so thick it clogs their guns and vehicles, the 7th Cavalry fights on.
And they're going to continue to fight on, and they're going to be able to protect the Pusan line, the Pusan perimeter. And not only are they successful at that, but after we take over the Pusan perimeter, we're going to start pushing the North Koreans back. And eventually, we're going to be able to take back almost all of South Korea. We're going to make our way into South Korea. We're going to start pushing back. And one of the biggest battles is the Battle of Incheon. I'm not going to quiz you on all the details of the Battle of Incheon, but everybody thinks that Incheon is going to be the next D-Day. They think it's going to have the size and the scale and the significance of a D-Day. It turns out not being that big of a deal, but the plan is to land troops in Incheon. They're going to land troops on sort of this beachhead, and then they're going to cut off supplies that the North are shipping down to their troops that are occupying the South. So we're going to go through this invasion. They're going to land. Again, they're thinking it's going to be crazy like D-Day. It turns out it is not.
September 15th, 1950, MacArthur's D-Day has arrived. The Incheon invasion is either a bold move that will change the course of the Korean War, or a landing so bloody it may rival Iwo Jima or Normandy.
At around 6 a.m. on the 15th of September, the actual landing part of the operation swung into action, under the cover of Allied naval gunfire. 6 British and American destroyers had already steamed in to within a mile of the city, and anchored so that their guns could fire at point-blank range on Wolmido and the entire Incheon area. For 2 days, Incheon had been bombed by aircraft dropping napalm on the North Korean defenses and pounded by warships. Now, under yet more covering fire, the landing craft used the high tide to sweep in from the sea and land on Wolmido's green beach. Through the chaos caused by the supporting fire, wave after wave of landing craft headed for Green Beach.
Smoke was boiling out of Incheon. The entire beach area simply disappeared in an enormous cloud of dust and smoke, with only the occasional glare of rocket bursts showing through. It was just awesome.
But as the first wave of Marines approached Green Beach, they were faced with a daunting task: scaling the 12-foot-high defensive seawalls under enemy fire.
Well, this is Green Beach on Wolmido today. Not quite the same sight that would have greeted the first wave of US Marines as they clambered up the sea wall. With the second wave of Marines just 4 minutes behind, they quickly advanced inland, the landscape blackened and blasted by the covering fire. The Marines swept over the island, meeting limited resistance and suffering few casualties. In just 2 hours, the Marines commander radioed the waiting fleet. Wolmido secured.
And awesome it was. It was an awesome American victory. Again, we think that it's going to be really this big battle, but it turns out not to be. A huge American success. We end up taking Incheon. After that, we're going to have to fight the Battle of Seoul for the capital of South Korea, and this ends up being a little bit more nasty. This is sort of the battle that everybody was expecting. It's a lot of street-to-street, hand-to-hand combat. It is a pretty nasty fight that we have there. By the time we get to September 28th, the United States will have complete control of South Korea again. We will have achieved the basic goal that the United Nations set out to achieve. So based on this, do you think the United States should try to conquer the North, or should we kind of stick with where we're at? And whatever you answer, try to explain why. Well, this debate that we just had is really the debate that Douglas MacArthur and President Truman have. They're going to go at it. And essentially, Truman is going to say, you know what, we achieved our original United Nations goal. We captured the South. We got the North out of the South. We achieved our goal. We achieved our mission. Let's call it quits. Let's be done. Truman was worried that if we continued to fight into the North, that we would basically start World War III, that eventually the communists from China and the Soviet Union would directly enter the war, and things would turn really nasty. Douglas MacArthur basically says, Truman, you're nuts. He says, you are crazy. No way. It's not going to happen. He says, we need to attack the North while they're weakened. After all, we just plowed over the occupation forces. We should be able to take them out easily. And when this battle kind of goes on, even though Truman still has a lot of hesitation, MacArthur is going to win the first round of the battle. MacArthur is going to get permission to continue on. And early on, it's a huge success. It turns out MacArthur is right. The United States is able to capture almost all of North Korea. Now, this is not part of the original United Nations goal, but this is something that we were able to do. And so early on, the battles were pretty successful. However, we eventually get to this area known as the Yalu River. And when we get to the Yalu River, surprise, surprise, turns out Truman was right. And about 180,000 Chinese communist troops storm in. They absolutely bombard the American military. On top of that, it's winter. It's terrible fighting. It's horrific. It is not good. And the Chinese not only are able to start winning battles, but they're able to push all the way back, retake Seoul, retake Incheon. They're able to take not all of South Korea, but they've now gotten all of the North back, and they've moved back into the South a little bit. When this happens, MacArthur says, look, the reason why we're losing is not because 180,000 Chinese communists come in, it's because Truman is a weak leader. MacArthur says that Truman needed to give him more power more quickly, and then on top of that, that we should just basically nuke the Chinese. That would be the way to defeat them. At this point in time, Truman is thinking, no, hold on. We're not going to pull nukes into this. We're going to start a nuclear war. We don't want World War III. We don't want a nuclear holocaust. Truman is saying, well, we just need to stay out of this. So on January 4th, 1951, Douglas MacArthur goes very public. So before all these debates and these fights are kind of taking place behind closed doors, then MacArthur goes very public and he says, look, Truman, we need to drop the bomb on China. We need to nuke them. If we nuke them, we can win. It's at this point that basically he's called his boss out in the public. Remember, Truman is the commander-in-chief of the U.S. military. He's supposed to be the one in charge. And when MacArthur calls him out, Truman is not only a little embarrassed, but, I mean, you just don't call your boss out on national TV. And so he does the only thing he's able to do, the only thing he can do. Truman very reluctantly fires Douglas MacArthur. He says, sorry, MacArthur, you're done. And this is going to lead to a lot of outcry. Now, Truman does what he's got to do because really we've got this idea in the United States known as civilian control of the military, the idea that the military doesn't get to decide what the military does, but rather that civilians get to control what the military does. And when MacArthur, a military guy, tries to take over the military, he just basically overextends his power, and Truman is forced to fire him. To be fair, MacArthur will come back to the United States. He will be hailed as a war hero. They'll have parades for him everywhere. It really is a glorious homecoming for MacArthur, but still it's a little sad because here's this great general, such success in World War II, really helped build Japan, successful in the early parts of the Korean War, but eventually it's just too much, and MacArthur decides that he's going to retire. Congress kind of wants to know what's going on, and so they call in MacArthur, and MacArthur gives this long famous speech, and in it he says, old soldiers never die, they just fade away, and now I close my career and just fade away. A lot of people thought that MacArthur probably could have run for president, probably could have defeated Truman, but MacArthur decides that he's not, that he's just going to kind of fade away. And so that will be the end of MacArthur's military career. From 1951 to 1953, we essentially see a state of stalemate. The North will push down on the South a little bit. They'll take a little bit of the South. Then the South will push back and take a little bit of the North. And we keep kind of going back and forth around this area of the 38th parallel until we get to 1953, when both sides say, you know what, we're going to have a quote-unquote temporary ceasefire. Now, we call it temporary because technically speaking, no peace treaty has ever been signed ending the Korean War, and technically we are still in a state of war, although nobody's really actively fighting. Every couple of years, maybe some things flare up here or there, but for the most part, there's no active fighting going on in Korea, but technically we're still in a ceasefire from the 1953 Korean War. Those were the terms of the armistice. And again, an armistice is a ceasefire. It's not an official treaty ending the war. It's just a temporary ceasefire. And so one of the things that we have agreed to do is that we will form a line of demarcation, basically the line dividing the North and the South, and it will be roughly along the 38th parallel, roughly kind of where we were at when most of the fighting stops. And so we're going to have this zone. This DMZ, demilitarized zone, which today is still one of the most heavily guarded, heavily defended borders in the entire world. There's about a 4 kilometer, about 2 miles, mile and a half-ish border gap between the two nations that's still heavily guarded today. As you know, President Trump is currently negotiating with Kim Jong-un, the president of North Korea, and while things are getting a little bit better, technically speaking, things are still not perfect, and there is still a very divided Korea. What we see is North Korea is still one of the most backward, behind, untechnologically advanced countries in the world, and South Korea is one of the most modern, advanced countries in the world. Some other conditions of the armistice: all the POWs get released. There will be some controversy over this, and some people believe that there are still POWs in Korea, but for the most part, all the POWs get exchanged. And again, we kind of go back to where we were before the war started. So the overall results of the Korean War, there is no winner. Sometimes people say that the Korean War was a tie. If you look at it from our original objective of getting the South free, by getting the North out of the South, America achieves its objectives, they win. But if you kind of extend the goal as to throwing back communism and overthrowing the communists in the North, we fail in that. So a lot of people consider Korea a tie, which is why Korea sometimes earns the nickname the Forgotten War. People don't really like to talk about wars that we didn't very clearly victoriously win. To be fair, our goal of keeping communism from spreading to the South, that is successful. So from that point of view, containing communism works, but overturning communism does not. And again, today we still have separate Koreas. There are still American troops that are occupying South Korea, trying to protect against North Korea. Just some kind of overview. You don't need to memorize it, but just to give you an idea, the Korean War at the time cost about 50% of the American budget. So half of all the money we were spending was being spent on the Korean War. That was the equivalent of about $67 billion at the time, $341 billion today. So a pretty costly war for the United States when all is said and done. Altogether, the number of lives lost, 54,000 Americans will die. And in the election of 1952, because Truman is unsuccessful at winning the war, Dwight D. Eisenhower will then take the election and will win. Other things, after the Korean War and the spread of communism in Korea, the United States is on more of a heightened alert for what do we do next? How do we contain communism? How do we stop communism from spreading? So when we think about the Cold War, we know it officially begins at the end of World War I. We know that there's the Red Scare going on, and things will get really, really bad in the 1950s, especially after the Korean War. That's all I've got for you today. Have a wonderful day.